Hello and welcome to the Origins of Islam. Today we want to look at the Christian context which led to the formation of Islam, the Christian context in which this Syrian anti-Trinitarian pre-Nicene Christianity evolved, which we've talked about before. So looking at the historical background in the last video, today we can dive into the theology. And we will start directly with the Logos. Logos is Greek and comes with a lot of different possible translations. Usually it's translated as word, though it's never used for word in the grammatical sense. That would be lexis, which has the same root and can be found in words like lexicon, but it's different nonetheless. So already the word logos is a little bit more abstract. In the realm of philosophy, logos became a technical term already in the 6th century BC and was typically meant to mean something along the lines of reason or reasoned debate. Philo of Alexandria, whom we can see on the 16th century depiction on the right, was then the first to adopt this term into Jewish philosophy. Philo was maybe the most important Hellenized Jew. That means a Jew who took on board a lot of Greek thought, which he incorporated into his Jewish philosophy. One of this element was the Logos. So Philo followed the Platonic distinction between imperfect matter and perfect form. But to bridge the enormous gap between the perfect God and the imperfect material world, intermediary beings were necessary. The Logos was the highest of these intermediary beings for Philo. He called it the firstborn of God, and he believed that the Logos also acted on behalf of God in the physical world. In particular, Philo identified the Logos with the angel of the Lord in the Old Testament. On top of that, for Philo, the Logos was God's instrument in the creation of the universe. Now, in Christianity, the Gospel of John identifies the Logos, through whom everything is made, as divine, and further identifies Jesus Christ as the incarnate Logos. So we have John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So Trinitarian Christians today interpret the Logos as the pre-existent second person of the Trinity. Now, translators have always struggled with the word Logos, as there was no adequate single word to translate it to. Often it's also understood as wisdom or knowledge. Often it's not translated at all. So for example, in many Bible translations, you can also read, in the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. Now with that in mind, let's have a look at what happened early on in the Christian church. And we want to start in the early 2nd century. And in particular, we want to home in onto the Syrian anti-Trinitarian pre-Nicene Christianity. The problem is our sources for the 2nd century are virtually non-existent. So we have to piece together their beliefs by looking at later texts, but also looking at contemporary texts from different traditions. One way of doing that is to look at Trinitarian Christians who do come from a similar background as those anti-Trinitarians. So for example, we can look at Saint Ignatius of Antioch, who according to tradition was the 3rd patriarch and bishop of Antioch after Simon Peter, and he died in 115 AD roughly. On the picture of the right, you can also see a depiction of Saint Ignatius. Now just to stress this again, Saint Ignatius was not one of those anti-Trinitarians. In fact, he was a Trinitarian as far as we can already call people in the 2nd century Trinitarians. The word Trinitarian hasn't come into use yet, but from his writings, it's pretty clear that he's talking about God the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost. So we can assume that he's at least a proto-Trinitarian. However, at the same time, he comes from a Syrian background and brings with him typically Syrian ideas. So for example, for him, works were a very important part of achieving salvation, which is a distinctly Syrian belief, which we can also see later. So we can reconstruct that also those Syrian anti-Trinitarians of the 2nd century already had a strong preference for works in this world. So if we go about this and we try to reconstruct what those anti-Trinitarians would have believed, then we can deduce that they would have been closer to a Jewish than a Hellenistic understanding of religion. Now, what do I mean by that? These Syrian anti-Trinitarian Christians were a Semitic people, and like the Jews, their understanding of religion was oriented in history, not in the nature of God, man, or the cosmos. For them, God acts in history through the prophets and through Jesus, and it's the job of the believers to figure out the wishes of God. They weren't so much interested in philosophical debates about the nature of God. They were interested in what does God actually want. And as Christians, for them, the pathway to God was through Jesus, who provided a template for how to live a life that's pleasing to God. Salvation is therefore achieved by following in the footsteps of Jesus, by proving oneself worthy, not by deifying Jesus or worshipping Jesus as God. Jesus for them was the servant of God, which is a term that we can find in all forms of Christianity, but particularly in these anti-Trinitarian traditions, where it was understood to mean that as a servant of God, he was subordinate to God because he was just a man. So therefore we can deduce that already in the 2nd century, they were strictly anti-Trinitarian monotheists who had an adoptionist Christology. Now this blurry picture gets a little bit more concrete with the man on the illustration to the right. This is an early 18th century depiction of Paul of Samosata, and he really is our best source for the Syrian pre-Nicene Christianity. He became Bishop of Antioch in 258 AD, which is a big deal. Back in those days, Antioch was one of the 3 main sees of the church. We had Rome, we had Alexandria, and Antioch. Those were the most respected bishops, and Paul of Samosata managed to become one of them. However, he wasn't particularly loved by other bishops, and in fact, he was denunciated at 2 synods in Antioch in 264 and 268 for his Christology. Paul rejected a physical interpretation of the Son of God title in the New Testament, because for him God is unique. Now we come back to this idea of the Logos. For Philo, the Logos is only an instrument of God. It's not God himself, it's not the Son of God, it's not a separate entity altogether. And the Logos inhabited the prophets, including Jesus, but in Jesus the connection was deeper. Paul rejected Jesus' pre-existence. He believed that Mary did not give birth to the Logos, only to the man. For him, Christ became great through his wisdom. Christ is just like us, but better in every way. The connection between Logos and Jesus results from Jesus' obedience. That means Jesus' learning, his following of the law, and as a result, his wisdom, not his nature. Paul believed that Jesus proved himself, and that's what made him the Christ. And to visualize this, let's have a look at how Paul explained it himself. Quote, "The Son only describes the man Jesus in whom God's wisdom dwells. Further, the Spirit is nothing but the grace of God." End quote. So we can see this is clearly an adoptionist theology. So Jesus was only a man. And also we can see that the Syrian theology is based on proving oneself. Jesus proved himself, hence God's wisdom, i.e. God's Logos, could dwell in him, and hence the grace of God, i.e. his Spirit, could rest upon him. And what we can see in this interpretation of the Logos is that it's very similar to how Islamic scholars would later understand the Logos. But before we move on, I want to add one more comment on Arianism, because very often people confuse Arianism and the religion of Paul of Samosata. And while they were similar and shared some fundamental features, they were also quite different. To make it simple, Arianism is basically a step from the Syrian anti-Trinitarian Christianity of Paul of Samosata towards Greek Christianity. Only a small step, but still significant. Arians believed that God foresaw that Jesus would prove himself, and hence he was given the nature that contained the Logos. So here we still have this focus on the importance of proving oneself in the eyes of God through works, but at the same time we already have this Greek idea included that Jesus was born divine. However, for Arians, while the Logos was more than just an attribute or an instrument of God, it was still created and hence subordinate to God. Therefore, Jesus was not part of a Trinity, he was a created being. And that is the big difference between both the Trinitarians on one side, for whom Jesus is part of the Trinity, and the Syrian anti-Trinitarians on the other side, like Paul of Samosata, for whom the Logos wasn't a being, it was just an instrument of God, and Jesus wasn't divine, he was just a man. Alright, so what happened next? As we've seen in one of the previous videos, when looking at the origins of Islam, there is a lot that indicates that it may have originated in Eastern Persia. So how did Christianity get into Eastern Persia? We've seen a little bit of it when we looked at the timeline, that there were deportations and so on, but that wasn't everything. In the East, Christianization started with Aramaic-speaking synagogues in the Parthian Empire, which means that the early proselytization probably started via the Ebionites. Now, the Ebionites, they were a group of Jewish Christians. So in their understanding, they would have been fully Jews and fully Christians. And they would have followed the Jewish laws, but at the same time, they believed Jesus to be the Jewish Messiah. which also means that they believe Jesus to be only a man, just like those Syrian anti-Trinitarian Christians, which we've just seen. However, these Ebionites, they soon disappear. Some believe that small communities may have survived up until the 7th century, but really they don't play much of a role in the region after the 2nd century. But maybe influenced by the Ebionites, maybe influenced by these Syrian Christians who had a similar mentality and a similar approach to religion. Early Persian Christianity definitely had a Jewish Old Testament focused bent. So while they were Christian, they would mostly use the Old Testament, and they were closer to this early Palestinian Christianity than to Hellenistic Christianity. As we've seen in our timeline episode, from the 3rd to the 6th centuries, there were mass deportations of Ishmaelites into Eastern Persia. Hundreds of thousands, many of whom were Christians. And those deportees probably were the most important seed for the blossoming of Christianity in Persia. Already in the 2nd century, Gnostic Christians appear in Syria and Persia as well. They were influenced by both Hellenism as well as Persian traditions. And in the 3rd century, Manichaeism develops in Persia, which at its height spreads from Central Asia to Northern Africa and even Italy. Also in the 2nd century, radical ascetic Christian sects form in Syria. These are often anti-Jewish, and the Diatessaron was written in that context. And as a reminder, the Diatessaron, that's a single gospel written by Tatian around 140 AD, wherein he combines the 4 canonical gospels into one narrative and translates it into Syriac Aramaic. And that was the only Aramaic language gospel for centuries. And it became very popular among all these Aramaic speaking Christians in Syria and in Persia. Another contributing factor for the growth of Christianity in Persia were the persecutions in the Roman Empire starting around 250 AD, where Christians were systematically hunted down. So many Western Syrian Christians flee into Persia, which for them isn't much of a jump because their languages would have been understood on the Persian side of the border just as well. The culture was comparatively similar, so they could easily fit in. And with them, they brought their understanding of Christianity. And as we have seen, this is also roughly the time in which Paul of Samosata became bishop. Now, for him to be able to become bishop, it means that he must have had a lot of local support. So there must have been many Christians like him who were anti-Trinitarians. So as these Christians move into Persia, they bring their anti-Trinitarian beliefs with them. Now in Western Syria, once these persecutions stop, the Greek Orthodox strands become dominant, meaning that Trinitarianism wins out. Eventually, these anti-Trinitarians don't play a role in the Roman Empire anymore, at least not a major role. Particularly after the Council of Nicaea, when this anti-Trinitarianism was formally declared as heretical, the anti-Trinitarians were henceforth excluded from the church. So someone like Paul of Samosata would have never been able to become bishop again. By the 4th century, we know that Christianity already had established itself in Persia. There were countless of churches and bishops, mainly along the Euphrates River, but also further to the east. A hierarchy forms within the Sassanid Empire, centered around the Bishop of Ctesiphon, which was the capital of the Sassanids, and who becomes the leader of the Christians in Persia. However, at that time, there were still 2 completely different Christian communities in Persia. We had a split between Greek and Syrians. These 2 groups had formed different hierarchies, different churches, different congregations. They were completely separate. And whereas the Syrians were mainly anti-Trinitarian, the Greeks were not. They were Trinitarian. But even with the Syrians in Persia, unlike in the Roman Empire, there was no Council of Nicaea, so there was no established doctrine yet. But that would change in the year 410 AD, when the Sassanid king Yazdegerd I convokes the Council of Ctesiphon. This council was sort of the Persian equivalent to the Council of Nicaea. The goal was to have a united Church of the East, just like there was a united church in the Roman Empire. Yazdegerd I, he saw how Christianity rapidly spread throughout his empire, and he feared that there would be mixed loyalties if the Roman Empire was seen as the Christian empire. So he wanted a Persian church to counter the Roman church. And for that, all of the Christians in his empire had to be united under one roof. And that roof would be the Church of the East, also known as the Nestorian Church. It was completely independent from Constantinople, and it united the Greek and the Syrian strands that we've just talked about, which were existent in the Persian Empire. The church did adopt the Nicene Creed, meaning that it formally adopted Trinitarianism. And the bishop of Ctesiphon became head of the church, the patriarch of the Church of the East. At this point, anti-Trinitarians were also excluded from the Church of the East. But unlike in the Roman Empire, the church wasn't yet as established everywhere. So it was pretty strong around the Euphrates Valley, but the further away you get from the center in Ctesiphon, the less of a foothold did it have. So what we see is that these anti-Trinitarian, they still survive for centuries to come, mainly in Christian regions where the Church of the East does not have a strong presence. Shortly after the Church of the East was established, Nestorians were deemed heretical by the Roman Church, which led to many Nestorians fleeing the Roman Empire into Persia after the Council of Ephesus in 431. In 489, the Byzantine Emperor closes the school of Edessa, which was sort of the intellectual center of Nestorianism, and students and teachers move into Persia, further increasing the Nestorian influence. And Nestorian influence means the Syrian influence. In the meantime, while Persia becomes more and more Nestorian and hence adopts more of a Syrian approach to Christianity, Western Syria turns to monophysitism, which is a form of Christianity that originates in Egypt, hence abandoning their Syrian Christian traditions. Okay, that is the end for today's presentation. In the next presentation, we will have a look at Syrian Christianity in the Quran. Until then, thank you very much for watching and see you next time.